The sky was blue, the sun was bright, and then, in the middle of the day, it started to disappear. No warning, no pattern anyone had ever seen before. Just darkness, swallowing daylight, minute by minute. What happened next inside that ancient camp was not just fear. It was something closer to the edge of survival itself, and by the end of this, you will understand why some ancient groups never fully recovered from a single afternoon like this one. If you want to know exactly how far that fear could go, stay through this one, because the next part explains something most people never think about when they picture a solar eclipse. To understand what a solar eclipse meant to an ancient human, you first have to understand what the sun meant to him at all. The sun was not just light. It was the reason plants grew, the reason animals moved, the reason the day existed instead of endless night. Ancient humans built their entire sense of time around it. Wake with it, hunt with it, return before it left. So when the sun began to vanish, without any reason he could name, it did not register as a strange sky event. It registered as the collapse of the one thing his whole world depended on. The first sign was subtle. The light dimmed, but not like a cloud passing. The color of everything changed. Shadows sharpened in a way that felt wrong. Animals reacted before humans did. Birds went quiet. Some animals began moving towards shelter, as if night had arrived hours early. That confusion in the animals often triggered the first wave of panic in the ancient camp, because animals were his warning system, and if they were frightened, he had learned to be frightened too. As the shadow of the moon spread further across the sun, temperatures actually dropped. Not by a small amount either. In some regions the air could cool several degrees in a matter of minutes. An ancient human standing in an open field would have felt that shift on his skin, and paired with the vanishing light, his body would have reacted the same way it did during any sudden threat. Heart rate increasing, muscles tightening, the urge to run or hide taking over rational thought completely. Now picture the final stage. Totality. The moment the sun is almost completely blocked, and only a thin, glowing ring remains around a black disk in the sky. For someone with no concept of astronomy, no understanding that the moon was passing in front of the sun, this moment could look like the sun itself was being consumed. Some researchers who study ancient reactions to natural events believe this exact image. A bright ring around a dark circle may be the origin of certain fire and serpent symbols found in very old cave markings, because ancient minds often explained frightening events by turning them into stories involving creatures they already feared. During totality, stars can sometimes become visible in the middle of the day. Imagine standing in an open landscape, no clouds, full daylight only minutes earlier, and suddenly seeing points of light in the sky the same way you would at night. For an ancient human with zero context for why this was happening, this single detail alone could be enough to convince him that the normal order of the world had broken. This is the part where survival instinct actually took over, and it did not look like calm observation. Groups have been theorized to react in a few very consistent ways during moments like this. Gathering tightly together for protection, since the instinct to avoid isolation during an unknown threat is deeply wired into humans even now. Loud noise making, banging tools or shouting, an instinct still seen today in cultures with surviving eclipse traditions, based on the belief that noise could somehow drive away whatever was consuming the sun. And in some cases, complete stillness, where fear overrides the instinct to act at all, and the body simply freezes in place. Here is where it gets more serious than most people expect. An eclipse rarely lasted more than a few minutes, but the psychological effect on a group could last much longer. If a group associated the eclipse with punishment, danger, or an angry sky, their behavior could shift for days or even weeks afterward. Some may have avoided open ground during daylight. Some may have changed hunting patterns out of fear the sky would darken again without warning. A single sky event, lasting only minutes, could quietly reshape the survival habits of an entire group. Now think about this for a moment before we continue. If your entire understanding of the world depended on the sun rising and setting the same way every single day, and it suddenly broke that pattern with zero explanation, what is the very first thing you think your instinct would tell you to do. Drop what you were doing. Gather everyone close. Run for shelter? Leave your answer below, because the reactions people imagine here are almost always more revealing than they expect. There is another layer to this that rarely gets discussed. Solar eclipses are not random. They follow a cycle, and over generations, some ancient groups appear to have noticed that. Long before anyone understood the mechanics of the sun and moon, certain communities began tracking recurring sky patterns, marking them in stone or memory, passing that knowledge down as a kind of early warning system. This transformed fear into something closer to preparation. A group that could anticipate an eclipse, even without understanding why it happened, could avoid the panic entirely. They could tell their children in advance. They could explain it as something expected rather than something monstrous. That shift, from total panic to cautious prediction, may be one of the earliest examples of ancient humans using pattern recognition to survive something they could not control. It did not require modern astronomy. It required patience, observation across many years, and the ability to pass information from one generation to the next with enough accuracy that it actually mattered. That alone tells you something about how advanced ancient problem-solving could be, even without a single tool we would recognize as scientific. Not every group reached that level of understanding, though, and that is part of what makes this topic so interesting. Isolated groups, smaller in number, with less contact with others, were far less likely to build up generational knowledge like this. For them, every eclipse may have felt exactly as terrifying as the first one their ancestors witnessed. No pattern, no preparation, just sudden darkness in the middle of the day, every single time it happened. There is a physical side to this most people never consider. The human body runs on an internal clock, tied closely to light. Hormones related to alertness and rest shift, depending on how bright or dark the surrounding environment is. During an eclipse, that internal clock receives a signal it was never built to interpret. Full daylight one moment, near darkness the next, followed by a return to daylight only minutes later. For an ancient human already relying on instinct rather than explanation, this rapid shift could produce genuine physical disorientation, not just fear. Dizziness, confusion, and a strange heaviness in the body have all been described in modern accounts of people witnessing an eclipse for the first time without prior knowledge of what it was. And there is little reason to believe ancient humans would have responded any differently. Sound behaved strangely too. As temperatures dropped and light faded, certain insects that were active during the day would go quiet almost immediately, while some nocturnal insects and animals could begin their evening sounds hours ahead of schedule. To an ancient listener, this was not a small detail. Sound was one of his primary ways of reading the environment for danger, and hearing the wrong sounds at the wrong time of day could be just as unsettling as the darkness itself. In many ways, the eclipse was not one strange event. It was dozens of small wrong signals arriving at once, each one reinforcing the sense that something in the world had broken. It is worth pausing here on something that connects directly back to survival itself. Fear, when it is sudden and unexplained, can be just as dangerous as the event causing it. A group that scatters in panic during an eclipse is more vulnerable to predators, more likely to become separated, more likely to make dangerous decisions in unfamiliar terrain, while visibility is dropping. In that sense, an eclipse was not just a frightening sky event. For a brief window, it was an actual survival hazard, created entirely by the reaction to it rather than the event itself. If this part surprised you, that fear itself could be more dangerous than the eclipse, that is worth carrying with you, because it applies to more situations in ancient survival than people usually assume. And honestly, it says something about human nature that has not really changed at all. As the shadow began to pass and light slowly returned to normal, the recovery moment mattered just as much as the panic itself. Some groups treated the return of full daylight as a kind of relief ritual, a moment where the group reaffirmed to itself that the danger had ended. Even without language for what had just happened astronomically, the emotional experience of watching the sun return likely created a shared memory strong enough to be repeated as a story for generations. long after the actual scientific cause was ever understood. This is part of why solar eclipses show up so often, in one form or another, across very different ancient cultures with no contact with each other. The event itself was rare enough to feel significant, frightening enough to demand explanation, and consistent enough in its pattern that groups eventually found ways to interpret it, predict it, or build meaning around it. Different landscapes, different tools, different daily lives, but the same sky event producing strikingly similar instincts: fear, gathering, noise, stillness, and eventually observation. There is one more detail worth sitting with before we close this out. The men who eventually became the ones tracking these patterns across years were, in a sense, the first specialists their communities ever had. Not hunters, not tool makers, watchers of the sky, whose only job was memory and pattern. Their value to the group was not physical strength or speed. It was the ability to turn a terrifying event into something predictable. And that single shift in role may have quietly planted the idea that knowledge itself could be as valuable to a group's survival as any weapon or shelter ever was. What this really shows is that the earliest form of science was not born from curiosity alone. It was born from fear that needed an explanation strong enough to survive. Long before anyone understood orbits or shadows or the relationship between the sun and moon, ancient humans were already doing the one thing that eventually became the foundation of astronomy itself. Watching the sky closely enough and long enough to notice when it broke its own rules. So the next time you hear about an ancient group reacting to a solar eclipse with fear, remember that this was not irrational behavior. It was survival logic applied to something completely outside their understanding, and in many cases, it eventually led to some of the earliest recorded observations of the sky in human history. If this kind of detail is exactly what you come here for, this channel is built entirely around moments like this, the specific instincts and reactions that never make it into the usual retelling of ancient human life, the small physical, sensory, and social details that shaped how survival actually worked, and staying around means you will not miss the next one.